Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Adath Israel's continuing series featuring members and friends of Adath as guest speakers. My name is Lawrence Bergman. I've been asked to moderate tonight's program, and I'm honored to do so. A little bit of housekeeping. As the rabbi said, everyone will remain muted throughout the program, but if you have any questions to ask our guest speaker, go to the chat button on your computer, and you could type in the question if time permits, so we'll go through most of the questions tonight. I've noticed a few people who've come on. I'd like to recognize one or two. I'd like to recognize the mayor of Colts and Luke, Mitchell Brownstein. Welcome. I'd also like to recognize the president of the Colts and Luke Senior Men's Club, David Gandel. Our guest speaker tonight is Anthony Housefather, the Member of Parliament for Mount Royal. Now, Mount Royal has always had distinguished MPs representing them in the House of Commons. How many of us can forget Alan McNaughton, who won 6 elections in Mount Royal? Then there was the gentleman who I attended his nominating convention. He came into the nominating convention with long hair, jeans on, and a jersey. He won the nomination, went on to win the election, went on to become Prime Minister of Canada. That was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Following Pierre Elliott Trudeau, we had that wonderful lady who was everyone's grandmother, everyone's mother, Sheila Feinstein, who we all remember so well. Following Sheila Feinstein, we have Erwin Cotler. Erwin Cotler, basically a universal Minister of Justice. He was the Minister of Justice in a Liberal government, and he was a member of the House of Commons, having won 6 elections. And now our distinguished MP, Anthony Housefather, who has won 2 elections. But I decided to maybe take a look and see who represented us prior to Alan McNaughton. And I found the gentleman who represented us for 9 years in the House of Commons prior to Alan McNaughton. His name, Fred Whitman. Now, no relation to Rabbi Whitman, but as you can well imagine, the name Whitman has a great connotation for us at Adath Israel. That's a name that we like very much. So our guest speaker, his scholastic career began, of course, in high school at Herzliya High School. Following that, he went on to McGill, where he earned 2 law degrees and then earned an MBA at the Molson School at Concordia University. His political career began in 1994 when he was elected to the City Council of the town of Hampstead. He, after that, moved on to the City of Colts and Luke and became the mayor of Colts and Luke for a period of 10 years. That took him to 2015. And in 2015, he was elected to the House of Commons and re-elected in 2019. I won't go through the many committees that Anthony sits on, but he's been named, and it's a prestigious post, to the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour. And finally, another position that he holds, which is very dear to all of us, he formed and was instrumental in creating the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. And the world is really small. A member of that committee, her name is Michal Cotler-Wunsch, and she is a daughter of our member, Erwin Cotler. So the world is small, and recently Mrs. Cotler-Wunsch referred to her working with Anthony on this committee. So it's a small world. Dear friends, if I were to be asked, what is Anthony's single most quality as an MP? And I would say, no matter what the political cost, this is a principled gentleman who speaks out loud and clear and has an opinion which he issues on issues of concern to his constituents, to the people of Quebec, and to the people of Canada. He never steps back from giving an opinion which is principled. He has issued opinions on racism, anti-Semitism, protection of minorities, the place of the English-speaking community in the province of Quebec, linguistic rights, and the notwithstanding clause, which we've heard a lot about recently. The Montreal Gazette in its lead editorial on May 27, 2021, wrote with respect to events in the Middle East and echoed here in the city of Montreal, and I quote, "Some leaders of the Jewish community, as well as MP Anthony Housefather, have called on all people of good conscience to speak up and reach out." And the Gazette said, "We add our voice to that request by Anthony Housefather and the Jewish community of Quebec." Dear friends, I present to you the MP from Mount Royal, Anthony Housefather.
Hey, thanks so much, Lawrence. Thank you. I think it's great to have Lawrence here as a mentor always, and as someone who is introducing me to a group of friends. And I want to also thank Rabbi Whitman. Michael has been a leading light in terms of human rights, in terms of speaking up for a community, whether it's on Bill 21 or whether coming before the House of Commons Justice Committee to speak out against conversion therapy, which is an evil practice where people are basically told that they can change their sexual orientation or sexual identity or gender expression, which they can't. And they're made to feel horrible. It leads to suicides. It leads to all kinds of horrendous things in people's lives. And Michael came before the committee and explained as a religious leader why the House of Commons needed to take action. And it's unfortunate that that bill, that very important bill, is now being held up by the Conservatives in the House of Commons, refusing to allow us even to vote and pass it on to the Senate because they object to the bill. But Michael is an example to all of us. So what do I want to talk about tonight? Now, as a member of Parliament, there's all kinds of issues that Canadians probably would want to hear about, but I've decided to tailor my remarks to the ones that I think this audience would probably be the most interested in today. I'm going to give a brief update on vaccinations and travel, and then I'm going to talk about two subjects that I know are really important to my electors, which is how are we fighting anti-Semitism, and how are we going to deal with Bill 96, and what is the federal government and provincial governments doing with respect to the rights of the English-speaking community. There's a lot of conflation of Bill C-32, which is a federal amendment to the Official Languages Act, and Bill C-96, and the constitutional amendment, and the block motion. So I want to try to clear all those things up, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. So first, contrary to what people were saying in February, where there was panic in Canada that nobody here would be vaccinated until 2023, and where we'd be the last country in the world to be vaccinated, as the Prime Minister actually said, we're right on track to be the first country in the world to reach herd immunity. We have the greatest number of people in the world that are vaccinated on first dose. Over 75% of Canadians that are eligible, 12 and over, have had their first dose of vaccine. And as of today, 22% have had their second dose. Over 20% more Canadians have had their first dose of vaccination than Americans. We're ahead of Israel on first doses of vaccination. We're ahead of the UK. We're first in the world. And by August, 75% of Canadians will have had their second dose and will be first in the world on 2 doses, which is an incredible accomplishment for a country that had no domestic production of vaccines. One of the things that we learned in this pandemic was that we were ill prepared to enter into a pandemic because we didn't have domestic capacity of production for vital things that, when you have a worldwide pandemic, are being sought by every country in the world on a worldwide market. One of those examples is personal protective equipment, where we have now created a domestic supply sufficient to have our needs on PPE met in Canada. And number 2 is vaccine production, where we had to source all our vaccines from Europe and eventually from the United States. Now, when the United States government under Trump told us that Americans couldn't export vaccines abroad, we had to arrange with all of our suppliers, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, to get our vaccines from Europe. Recently, thank goodness, the Biden administration has loosened those requirements, and we've been able to source the Pfizer vaccine and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson from the United States. And that's made it a lot easier for us to get the tens of millions of doses that we need to vaccinate all Canadians. But we were able, through the strategy that we pursued, basically signing contracts with every possible vaccine manufacturer, to get more per capita vaccines into Canada than to any other country that didn't have domestic production. Remember that the UK and the United States had domestic production of vaccines. When people were trying to compare us with the United States at the beginning, they ignored the fact that Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson are all produced in the United States, and the United States was able to reserve all of the capacity for itself. Canada didn't have that because in the 1980s, our last source of domestic vaccine production was closed. So what have we done to counter that? I've already talked about PPE, but when it comes to vaccines, tomorrow morning, I will be on Royal Mount in our riding at the National Research Council to announce the opening of our first domestic bio manufacturing lab for vaccines. It is finished. We had said it was going to be finished in July. It will be finished ahead of schedule. Tomorrow is the official opening or the end of construction. And then the lab will be certified and will be able to produce 2 million doses of vaccine per month, which is a beginning. That's 24 million doses per year. And in a similar lab in Saskatchewan that can produce even more doses is opening as well in the near future. Moreover, we are incentivizing Canadian companies to not only develop vaccines, but to manufacture them in Canada. And so the important thing here is Canadian companies will start to have their own domestic vaccines in capacity, but the government will have capacity to license vaccines from abroad or domestically and produce them in government-run facilities. So that's good news. The other thing that I wanted to mention today, as probably many of you have heard, who are asking, well, when will the quarantine end? For those of you who are double vaccinated and have passed 14 days from your second dose, you will now no longer need to quarantine when you return to Canada from abroad. You'll need to fill in the information, have proof of vaccination, and have a negative COVID test when you enter Canada, but you will not need to go to a hotel. And once the negative COVID test comes back, after 24 hours, you will not need to quarantine. That is the first step that we said we would get to when we reach 75% first dose, 20% second dose. And then people are asking when the borders will reopen. And the answer to that is our public health agency has said when we reach 75% second dose, which is probably at some point in late July, early August. So that is the best information that I have right now. Of course, the Canada-US border is determined every month by negotiations between the Biden administration and our government. And I don't know what they will determine for July the 21st. But for the moment, you as Canadians can fly to the United States because the United States never closed its airports to Canadians. You can't cross the land border, but you can fly to the US. And when you return, you will not need to quarantine. And it's not Canada that tells you you can't leave in the land border because as Canadian citizens, you can leave Canada whenever you want. The question is how the United States lets you enter. So I can't control the United States border on the land border, but the end result is as Canadians, you're able to fly wherever you want to go and come back whenever you want, and you're good. You won't need to vaccinate. You won't need to, as long as you're vaccinated, you won't need to quarantine as of July the 6th. But don't come back before July the 6th because somebody that comes back on July the 5th will still need to quarantine for 14 days. So if you're abroad, if you're in Florida and watching this, don't come back until July the 6th, unless you really are desperate to be here in quarantine. Let me talk to you a little bit about anti-Semitism. I got up in the House of Commons recently and said that anti-Semitism in Canada after the Gaza conflict was worse than it has been in Canada since the 1930s. There was a significant and drastic escalation of anti-Semitism that occurred in the weeks following the Israeli conflict with Hamas. And it was a shock, I think, to many of us because we're lucky. Lawrence talked about a group of parliamentarians, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. But talking to people who are Jewish, who live across the world, whether it's parliamentarians, or whether it's athletes that I meet at Maccabea Games, or whether it's other people that I meet at World Jewish Congress meetings. Canada is completely unique, along with the United States and Australia. Those are the only three countries where when Jews are talking about speaking to their politicians about Israel, they're actually able to feel empowered to demand that their politicians vocally defend Israel, as opposed to hoping that their politicians shut up about Israel and never say a word because it fosters domestic anti-Semitism. Countries throughout the world live with governments that never vote in favor of Israel at the United Nations. We as Canadians are spoiled, and in fact, many within our Jewish community are completely out to lunch sometimes about how much our government supports Israel. At the United Nations, first of all, people get confused about the UN Human Rights Committee. We don't sit on it. Canada has no seat on that committee that singles out Israel all the time. We only get to sit on it once every decade because it splits amongst countries that rotate seats. So whenever people come and complain about the Human Rights Council and say, why didn't Canada vote against? We don't have a seat there. But when it comes to General Assembly votes, Canada, since Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister in 2015, has voted against 87.8% of the anti-Israel resolutions that have come to the UN General Assembly. The United States has voted against 91%. No other country has voted against more than 32%, and that's Australia. The UK, France, Germany, Argentina, Japan, China, Russia, Belgium have voted against 0%. Let me repeat, 0% of the anti-Israel resolutions. So when I get from you videos of Boris Johnson or Theresa May wishing the Jewish community a happy Chag, and you send it to me and you say, why is Justin Trudeau as vocal in support of our Jewish community and Israel as Boris Johnson or Theresa May and these wonderful conservative politicians from the UK? Well, Canada under Justin Trudeau has voted against 87.8% of the resolutions at the UK that single out Israel. And this wonderful country, the UK conservative government, has voted against 0 since 2015. That should be a lesson to people that choose amongst their facts and don't ever pay attention to what governments are actually doing. I've gotten so many questions. Why didn't Justin Trudeau criticize Hamas? Every statement Justin Trudeau made since the Israel-Gaza conflict started, Justin Trudeau said that Hamas is a terrorist organization and that Israel has the right to defend itself. It was part of our government's lines. It was something that Mark Garneau said repeatedly every time he was asked the question. Our government has been unequivocal about that point. And Israel itself, go ask any Israeli ambassador to Canada, Nimrod Barkan, our former ambassador that has not been replaced yet, since Israel has not yet had a stable government since he left. We are one of the three countries that Israel views as an ally: Canada, the US, and Australia. We are the three Western countries. Of course, there are little islands like Micronesia and Nauru that vote with Israel, but I omit them because most people would not be able to find them on a map. But of actual real countries that you could name and point out on a map, we're one of only three. And so while sometimes the Jewish community would wish that our Prime Minister talked about Israel and nothing else, he criticizes anti-Semitism and defends Israel as well as any other politician that's in power in any country that I know. I will point out to the fact, if you ask me, some people say, what has your government done on anti-Semitism? Well, let's look at what our government has done on anti-Semitism since 2015. We adopted a motion in the House of Commons that liberals voted for that said that BDS was another form of anti-Semitism and criticized all Canadian groups that promote BDS. Justin Trudeau has gone to university campuses across the country and condemned BDS. The only world leader I know that's ever done that and been booed at university campuses for holding that position. Our government was the 6th government in the world to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that is the consensus of Jewish communities, 6th in the world. And it forms one of the 4 major planks of our anti-racism strategy. There's anti-racism, there's anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ+, there's anti-Islamophobia, and there's anti-Semitism. And we have quadrupled funding under our infrastructure program for synagogues, for schools, for Jewish community centers to increase security. This week, we got news that synagogues and schools in our riding got $1 million in order to improve and enhance security. So there are a lot of things that we've done. What else have we done? We did the apology for the St. Louis and for Jewish, anti-Jewish sentiment in Canada in the 20s and 30s. And most recently, with the escalation of anti-Semitism, there are 3 occasions in the last month where Justin Trudeau, including last Saturday, put out a statement opposing and saying he despised the anti-Semitism that was going on in Canada. And we created a national summit chaired by Erwin Kotler on anti-Semitism that's going to happen this summer, a national emergency summit on anti-Semitism. And we named Erwin Kotler as our international representative to combat anti-Semitism. So our government, and I believe I've been a very essential part of that, has been incredibly assertive on these issues. And that's one thing that I do as your representative. As Lawrence will tell you, I am your voice in the Liberal caucus, in the national caucus that we have every week with the Prime Minister, and in the Quebec caucus that we have every week, to make clear that we need to prioritize these issues and where we need to stand on these issues. That while we need to combat and fight Islamophobia as hard as we do anti-Semitism, we can't conflate the two. And I understand that many people are concerned that sometimes statements seem to be, oh, this and that, and combining anti-Semitism with other things, but that's not what we've done. We've been really clear that we oppose anti-Semitism firmly, compellingly, and I am the most assertive person in caucus, along with my colleague Yara Sachs and my colleague Rachel Ben-Dayan. There's 8 Jewish members of the Liberal caucus, but not all of us are as assertive on these issues, but I assure you I am one of the people that is the most assertive. And then the online anti-Semitism task force that I want to talk to you about. As Lawrence mentioned, we're lucky that Erwin Kotler's daughter, Michal Kotler-Wunsch, was an Israeli member of the last Knesset. She was elected as part of the Blue and White Party and was able to enter the Knesset when one of their members was named to cabinet and resigned their seat in the Knesset, and she got into the Knesset. And she was the first Israeli politician that I've run into that fervently was as interested in our Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Friendship Group as we are on the Canadian side. And I am the president, by the way, of the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Friendship Group. And she wanted to work with me on making sure that our group did things. And so one of the first things that we decided to do was we need to go beyond Canada and Israel. We need to combat online anti-Semitism, which is the core way that anti-Semitism is introduced into our environments. B'nai Bris audits will tell you that over 80% of anti-Semitic incidents start online. And so we said, let's go and get members of parliament, members of Congress, members of legislatures of all the English-speaking countries and Israel, and work together to have a united front when we're dealing with Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and all of the online platforms that don't necessarily enforce their rules about online hate. Because as you know, if you post something on Facebook here in Canada, you're going to see it in the United States. You're going to see it in Australia. You're going to see it in Israel. You're going to see it in the UK. You cannot deal with online hate only by one country. So Michal and I were able to get a nonpartisan group of MPs. In Canada, I'm joined by Conservative Marty Morantz and New Democrat Randall Garrison. From the United States, we have Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Ted Deutsch, who are Democratic Congress people. And we have Mario Diaz-Balart and Chris Rogers, who are Republican members of Congress. In the UK, we have a Labour and a Conservative MP. In Australia, we have a Liberal and a Labour MP. In New Zealand, we have a Green and a Labour MP and a National Party MP. We are all working together And I have a meeting tomorrow with Debbie Wasserman Schultz for us to plan how we're going to release our interim report. But our committee is already at the stage of an interim report that we're going to make public internationally on how we would recommend that countries confront online hate. So that's just one thing that I'm working on as your local member of parliament, because as you know, you don't elect a party and you don't elect a prime minister. You elect one person, your local member, that is there to fight for you. You won't change who the prime minister of Canada is or what party forms a majority of government. You can only change who the one person that speaks for you in the House of Commons actually is. And for that, I want to talk about English rights in Quebec. And I want to talk about the concerns our community has expressed about Quebec's Bill 96. So let's start from the premise that there are multiple things here. Quebec has proposed Bill 96. Bill 96 is a very, very problematic piece of legislation that the Quebec Community Groups Network under Marlene Jennings, a former member of parliament, and other English-speaking leaders have been very clear is a frontal assault on the rights of the English-speaking community. I share their perspective that Bill 96 is infinitely problematic and needs to be drastically amended or voted down. But I am a federal MP. I have no say or no vote on Bill 96. I'm simply a voice for the community like each and every one of you. Of course, I have a bigger bully pulpit than you do, and I have used it. I have been the only member of parliament that I know of from any political party that has spoken out against Bill 96 forcefully. I have spoken out not only against the use of the notwithstanding clause under Bill 96. So let's talk about the fundamental construct of Bill 96. Bill 96 says that the Charter of the French language supersedes the Quebec Charter of Rights. That never existed in language legislation in Quebec. Even the Parti Québécois, when they were in power from 1980 to 1985, and they overrode the Quebec Charter, the Canadian Charter of Rights, they never used the notwithstanding clause or overrode the Quebec Charter, so that people could always attack the Quebec Charter of Rights and the Quebec language laws in court using the Quebec Charter of Rights. And since then, since 1985, the notwithstanding clause was used once by the Bourassa government when Bill 178 was passed on signs, but it was never again used by any Liberal government of Quebec on the charter, on the French language charter. This is the first time that not only is the notwithstanding clause being used, but now they're saying that you can never attack the Quebec French language charter based on the Quebec Charter of Rights. So then you get to the Federal Charter of Rights, and they're using the notwithstanding clause to remove fundamental freedoms. So basically they're saying freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom from search and seizure. All of these concepts are overridden by the notwithstanding clause, and people will not be able to take Bill 96 to court for at least 5 years because there's a preemptive omnibus use of the notwithstanding clause. Now, what does preemptive mean? It means that when the notwithstanding clause was originally brought to the charter as a compromise in 1982, it was meant to follow a court judgment. It was meant that after a court said that this law is unconstitutional because it violates the charter, that a government with its population's full knowledge that this bill or law was in violation of the Charter of Rights and not subject to reasonable and not viewed as being a reasonable limit on the right under Section 1, the government would then, with a full knowledge of its population, use the notwithstanding clause to block the judgment in that one area. That's what the Liberal government had done in 1989 with Bill 178 on the language of signs. They didn't make the notwithstanding clause apply to the whole French language charter. They made it apply to that one point on signs after the judgment. Now, Quebec is preemptively using the notwithstanding clause like they did on Bill 21 on the whole French language charter. And that's enormously problematic because, for example, I'll give you 2 examples that I illustrated in a speech in the House of Commons last week. Number one, they're saying that for certain services in English, you need to be somebody who has access to English schooling in Quebec. Access to English schooling in Quebec under Section 23 of the Charter of Rights means that you or your parents or grandparents need to have been educated in English in Canada. or a sibling, etc. You had to have the majority of your education in Canada in English. If you moved here from the United States or Australia, you would not be someone who had the majority of their education in English in Canada, even though English was your mother tongue. And likely your parents and grandparents weren't educated in English in Canada. So you might move here to marry a Canadian, and your Canadian spouse and your children may have access to English language schools and the certificate, but you wouldn't. And you'd likely be the one person in your family, because you moved here from the US or Australia, that wasn't able to speak French. But you'd be the only person in your family that would not be entitled to access services in English because you weren't entitled to go to English school in Quebec. And what if you're a Holocaust survivor who moved here in 1947 after the war, and you've been part of the English-speaking community your whole life, and you're 95 years old? You don't have access to English-speaking schools in Quebec. And I pointed this out in my speech in the House of Commons, and I was blasted by the Journal de Montréal and by former PQ leadership candidates for somehow claiming that I compared Bill 96 to the Holocaust. I didn't compare Bill 96 to the Holocaust. I said that a Holocaust survivor, after 70 years as part of the English-speaking community, could lose certain services in English in Quebec, and that was atrocious. And I stick by that. And again, I was the only speech. There have been 2 debates in the House of Commons on this issue. There was a speech that the Conservatives called for about the protection of French in Quebec, and I was the only person to speak in English in that debate, and I was the only person to speak about the rights of the English community as well as the rights of French-speaking Quebecers. And then this debate last week on this block motion, where I was the only person to express concerns about Bill 96, and especially about the concerns the English-speaking community had. And so another issue, for example, on Bill 96, is that they've said that in order for exemplary practices, 2 bureaucrats in the Quebec government need to speak to each other and write to each other in French, even if both of them are Anglophones. It makes absolutely no sense. It's a violation of freedom of expression. It clearly wouldn't be saved under Section 1 of the Charter, and that's in Bill 96. And there's all kinds of problems with Bill 96. But those problems with Bill 96 are being confused with other issues. And I am a political and judicial pragmatist. And so when I'm fighting on issues for you in the caucus, I have to find a way to reach consensus and agreement. So what has the federal government put forward? The federal government has put forward a modernization of the Official Languages Act. That was in the works for years. And there is nothing problematic or villainous about that bill. You can read Tom Mulcair's column in the Gazette last week. But in my view, there is nothing inherently problematic in what has been put forward in the amendment to the Official Languages Act. And I have worked very closely with Minister Joly on it, because there was one thing that was a desperate problem that our community faced and still faces in the House of Commons. And let me explain. The Bloc Québécois now has both the Conservatives and the NDP on their side on all of the issues related to nationalism and the use of French in Quebec. And several months ago, the Bloc Québécois put forward legislation that wanted the Quebec Charter of the French Language, Bill 101, to apply to federal institutions. I fought against that vigorously in my caucus. I led the fight along with other English-speaking MPs from Quebec and French-speaking MPs from outside Quebec, but I led that fight to make sure that the Liberal Party of Canada would never allow Quebec's French language charter to apply to federally regulated businesses. And this week in the House of Commons, there was a vote at second reading on that block bill. And the Bloc, the Conservatives, and the NDP all voted in favor of that bill. And it's going to committee right now. That bill says, it's a block bill that the Conservatives support, that in Quebec, the Charter of the French Language, Quebec's language law, will apply federally. That has never happened before. And only the Liberals voted against that. And we are a minority currently in Parliament. And so that is a great danger. And that's not the only bill that the Bloc has put forward that the Conservatives have supported. The Bloc put forward a different bill that said that in order to become a Canadian citizen in Quebec, you had to have mastered French. In the rest of the country, it's either English or French. And it's always been the case that in all of Canada, you can be sworn in and do your test in English or French. And so what about the Hasidic Jewish person that comes to Montreal to marry somebody from New York? What about our Filipino community that is perfectly fluent in English and works 2 jobs taking care of us and our grandparents and our children and doesn't have the time to learn French before they're eligible to become a citizen? I fought tooth and nail against that block bill. And I was really proud that the Liberal Party voted against, again, that bill that the Conservatives and the Bloc supported. We were lucky on that one that we got the support of the NDP and the bill was defeated. But we are in a bad situation as English-speaking Quebecers where the Conservatives and the Bloc are ganging up on us, and Erin O'Toole is as nationalist as the Bloc leader, Yves-François Blanchet. They're all trying to win seats in rural Quebec, and this is a danger for our community. So coming back to the issue in the reforms to the Official Languages Act, I myself, as the biggest defender for English-speaking Quebec, proposed an alternative to our party. I said that Quebec is going to try in Bill 96 to occupy the space, to regulate federally regulated businesses, which they did in Bill 96. They are trying to make it apply to federally regulated businesses. So I said in our amendment to the Official Languages Act, let's occupy that space. Let's make sure there is a federal law there that is not Bill 101, that is different, that doesn't attack the rights of the English-speaking minority. That then means that the court will say that Quebec cannot regulate federally regulated businesses on language because the federal government has legislated. And that is the part of the reforms of the Official Languages Act that English-speaking Quebecers in the Gazette are nervous about. Because for the first time, we're enshrining a right to work in French, but that right to work in French is completely different than the right to work in French under Quebec's Bill 101. It doesn't stop someone from hiring somebody or requiring somebody to know English when you hire them. It doesn't mean that English-speaking employees in the business can't get served in English also. It doesn't mean that the employer can't communicate with you in English as well as French. And so I want to just give the background as to what the concern is and explain why I even support us doing it. Because by doing it, we prevent Quebec from legislating on federal businesses. But it doesn't mean that we win here because the opposition parties still have a bill in front of Parliament that they all support, and they're the majority in Parliament. We're just the minority as Liberals because we're a minority government that essentially says Bill 101 should apply. So if the Parliament continues in the fall, if there's no election, and I don't know if there will or will not be one, well, we're going to be in a situation where that is coming up before a parliamentary committee and only the Liberals are against it. So we have to worry about that as well. We're right now as a community really, really, really in a bad place. I'm just checking to see what time my vote is. Sorry, let me just see. 7:38 before I have to vote, and everybody can watch me vote. So last thing I'm going to deal with is what was this block motion? So Quebec has proposed as part of Bill 96 that they can unilaterally amend the Constitution through Section 45 of the Constitution Act of 1982 to declare 3 things: that the Québécois form a nation, that French is the official language of Quebec, and that French is the common language of the Québécois people. So the block motion, which was a clever political move brought before the House of Commons, even before Bill 96 has been debated, amended, or adopted at the National Assembly. And all of you who are concerned about Bill 96 should be contacting your member of the National Assembly, right? Your member of Parliament can speak, but your member of Parliament has no vote. I'm not going to be there to amend the bill. I'm not the one who can choose who comes to testify before the committee that's studying the bill. You all need to go to your member of the National Assembly and tell them what amendments you want. And I'm happy to work with our Liberal members like David Birnbaum and Pierre Arcan and Greg Kelly and Kathleen Weil and Jennifer Macaron on this bill. But it's them that has control on the bill, not me. And one of the things that Quebec will need to study is this proposed wording of the constitutional amendments. But what the Bloc did was they put forward a motion to the House. And the motion to the House said, the House recognizes that Section 45 is in the Canadian Constitution, which it is, and the House takes note that Quebec intends to modify the Constitution through Section 45 to do X, X, and X. That motion doesn't state that we agree with what Quebec intends to do, and the motion doesn't state that we even agree that Section 45 applies to what Quebec intended to do. So it was very difficult not to vote yes to that motion, because the motion is actually capturing the truth in terms of the fact that it's saying Section 45 exists, which it does, and that Quebec intends to do it, which it's announced it intends to do. But I argued vehemently that we needed to amend that motion, because there would be umpteen people confused about that motion. There would be umpteen people that would read the motion, and the Bloc would pretend that the motion said something that it didn't, that the Bloc would claim the House endorsed that Section 45 applied, or the House would claim that, or the Bloc would claim that the House endorsed what Quebec intended to do, which the motion did not do. So I argued vehemently in caucus, including in front of the Prime Minister, and said we need to propose an amendment as Liberals to this motion that would say two things. Number one, that the House actually does not accept that the Québécois are simply a people, but rather a people within a united Canada, which was the construction of the House in 2006 that Harper had put forward that was adopted by the House. And number two, that any amendment that Quebec proposes under Section 45 unilaterally can have no impact on the rights of the English-speaking community of Quebec under the Canadian Constitution. So nothing within that could serve to change the sections of the Constitution that are related to English-speaking Quebec, Section 133, that talks about the fact that English is a language of the legislature and the courts, our rights under the Charter, or be an interpretive clause that would limit our rights under the Charter or allow Quebec to argue for a Section 1 limitation on those rights. And the Liberal Party agreed. And they allowed me to be the second speaker in the debate after Pablo Rodriguez, our Quebec lieutenant. And I spoke about all my concerns about Bill 96, about the constitutional amendment, and I proposed our amendment that had the support of the Liberal cabinet and the Liberal caucus. And the Bloc Québécois refused to allow the amendment to be voted on, which is their right because it was their motion. But as a result, myself and 11 other Liberal MPs from Quebec who represent English-speaking or allophone ridings abstained on the vote because we, without that amendment, did not feel comfortable, even though it was a statement of fact, voting in favor of the Bloc motion. And that's why I abstained. I couldn't vote no because intellectually there was nothing false in the motion, but I couldn't vote yes because the amendment that I put forward to clarify the motion for my constituency and the people that were concerned wasn't accepted to even be voted on. And I think it would have passed. At least all the Liberals would have voted for it. So in the end result, the Bloc motion means nothing, but it is important to note that if Quebec does use Section 45, which is what they say they want to do, in the current framework of Parliament, where the Bloc, the Conservatives, and the NDP seem to be ganged up against the Anglophone community all the time, it's actually better right now that Parliament is not called upon to vote on that constitutional amendment. Because if Section 43B is used, which is required if an amendment is supposed to have teeth and affect the rights of the English-speaking or French-speaking language in Quebec, then it might pass in the House of Commons. So we're way better off that Quebec is saying it's doing it unilaterally, because when it does it unilaterally, it actually cannot have an impact on our rights, because Section 43B says if it's intended to have an impact on our rights, the Parliament of Canada has to pass it too. So I know these are complex constructions, but I just know that I have everybody's back. I do everything I can. I understand what it is that my constituents are concerned about. And I always will be there trying for you. So now I'm happy to take questions. And I'll pass it over to Lawrence or Michael to read out any questions that you have, or to see whatever's in the chat.
So Anthony, I have a question here coming from Wayne Haas. Reads as follows: Fredericton MP Jenica Atwin, a noted anti-Israel and anti-Semite, was just welcomed into the Liberal Party and Government of Canada. Do you, as a Jewish MP, support this move of acceptance of Jenica Atwin by Justin Trudeau?
So again, Jenica Atwin is one of many MPs that exist in all parties that have positions on Israel that I don't agree with. Since she's become a member of the Liberal Caucus, Jenica Atwin was sensitized immediately by her Jewish colleagues and by her pro-Israel colleagues to the nature of her comments, to the one-sided and anti-Semitic nature of the apartheid comment that she made, and she apologized. She apologized a week ago, 2 days after joining the Liberal Caucus. The day she joined the Liberal Caucus, Mark Garneau stated clearly as our Foreign Affairs Minister that her position that she had expressed is categorically opposed to that of the Liberal government. And 2 days after she joined the caucus, she issued an apology. I've spoken directly with her on multiple occasions now, and she actually, I believe, will end up being an ally for us in the Liberal caucus. She had no understanding of the issue. She and the Green Party got a one-sided portrayal of Israel that is very common on the left in Canada. And she didn't know the history of the region. She was making comments from a place where she didn't have the historical knowledge, the knowledge of the complexity of the issues. And by being in a caucus like the Liberal caucus that brings together people from a multiplicity of different backgrounds, within a couple of days, myself and other colleagues were able to get her to apologize. And I think you're going to see yet another statement from her this week that I've been talking to her about, even more specifically addressing, how she now realizes that previous comments she made were anti-Semitic. So I'm actually now, my issue is not with Jenica. I would have preferred that this be dealt with before the day she joined the Liberal caucus. It should have been announced at the press conference the day she joined, but I have no issue with her now being in the Liberal caucus because she's disavowed to me personally and publicly the positions that she held that were problematic.
Thank you, Anthony. I have a question here from Philip Singer. Please explain how it is possible for a province to make changes to federal laws as Quebec has planned to do.
They can't. The Quebec does not plan to make changes to federal law. Quebec plans to amend Quebec's own constitution, which Quebec can do by its own legislation. Any change made by Quebec under Section 45 cannot change or be part of the Canadian Constitution or impact the rights of anyone under the Canadian Constitution. This would be a purely symbolic move by Quebec if done under Section 45. What I have explained to you, though, is if we argue, which is very possible to argue, that, for example, the amendment of the common language of the Quebecois nation being French, or that French is the only official language of Quebec, would impact the rights of French or English in Quebec, and it should be done by act of federal parliament as well as the act of the legislature of Quebec, then it would be a 43B amendment, which could indeed impact the Canadian Constitution. So under the current circumstances, I have no problem that Quebec says, that Quebec does it unilaterally because it can't amend the Canadian Constitution. It can only amend the Quebec one. And by the way, I now have a vote, so I'm going to show you how I vote. So here is my screen. It says vote ongoing. I now press the button that now says that I want to vote. I have a green button on my screen that says vote. I press the green button. It wants to access my camera. I let it access my camera. And then it says cast your vote, yay, nay, or abstain. I'm voting yay. So I press yay, green button. I then press continue. It says your selection is yes. I agree. My selection is yes. I press continue. And then it wants to take a picture of me so that it can validate it is me that's voting and not Lawrence Bergman. So I press take the picture. It says to move it closer, hold steady. The face map has then authenticated my picture. It's confirmed my identity and it asks me if I want to submit my vote, which I do. I submit my vote. I voted yay, and it took a minute. And that is what I'll be doing for all 26 votes until 6 in the morning that I have tonight.
Anthony, could you be kind enough to explain us what you were voting on and the discussions that you might have had in caucus on the vote that you just made, so we would understand the background of how the vote takes place and what you just voted on?
Absolutely. So what I've now voted on is a motion to closure, which will lead to an end of debate and a commencement of votes on the on the Broadcasting Act, C10. The Broadcasting Act is being amended. It hasn't been amended since 1991 to take into account Netflix and Disney and all of those non-traditional broadcasters that we didn't have in the equation since, you know, when we made the law in 1991, and to try to put them on a plane of equality with CTV and Global and the Canadian traditional broadcasters that have to pay into funds, that have to ensure Canadian programming, and also they have to pay royalties to Canadian artists. So this is a bill that the Conservatives, as usual, have fought firmly against, that the Liberals and New Democrats and the Bloc support. And we're going to be moving to votes tonight on many, many amendments to the bill brought by all parties. I brought myself to this bill 14 different amendments. Most of them were to improve minority language rights, to ensure, I actually am very proud of this. The broadcasting bill, I sit on the Heritage Committee. The 7 amendments I brought on language to the broadcasting bill mean that the entire Broadcasting Act has to take into consideration as one of its guiding lights minority language communities and their rights, meaning that we can't allow everything in English to only come from Toronto. There has to be English language production in Montreal, as the same way that French language production can't all come from Quebec. It has to be all over Canada. And to make sure that our communities are consulted on the bill. And I also, as an English-speaking person, am very concerned about original French content from Canada and brought forward amendments to promote original French content. I also worked with our Canadian producers to revise the rules related to what is Canadian content, to make sure that Canadian artists could own the underlying rights and not have to sell them off to Netflix. So I worked with Canadian groups to put forward my amendments. And this is something interesting, right? It's a government bill from the Liberal government, but I, as a Liberal member, brought forward my own amendments to the bill. I didn't just blindly vote for what the government brought forward. I studied the bill. I listened to the groups. I listened to my own community, particularly the English-speaking cultural groups from Quebec. And I brought forward amendments to the bill that were accepted and voted on and unanimously passed, in many cases by the Liberals, the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP, and in other cases just by the Liberals and the NDP. But I got all my amendments through. And that makes a huge difference. That's one of the things I can achieve as a member of Parliament. Being part of committees and having my say is the same as the way I have my say in caucus. And so tonight, we're going through the Broadcasting Act, hoping to reform the Broadcasting Act, and those are the 26 votes tonight that we have.
Anthony, could you just give us an idea how this bill goes through caucus, or when it goes through caucus, and if the minister makes a presentation and there's discussion in caucus?
Sure. So when a bill is first introduced, like, first of all, before a bill is introduced, you have discussions amongst your caucus members, meaning a good minister, not all ministers, but a good minister will do caucus consultations in addition to other consultations that you'll do before you bring forward a bill. For example, I'm the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour. That means that in this Parliament, I am viewed as part of government in the sense that I'm the second in command in Labour. I will answer the questions in question period in Labour when the minister's not there. I will replace her in all of her functions, and I'll work with our Minister of Labour on Labour bills and on issues like strikes at the Port of Montreal, for example, in terms of making decisions. And so when we have a Labour bill, we consult all of the stakeholders. We consult, before we write a bill, we consult the unions, we consult the employers groups, we consult all of the groups representing women and groups representing Indigenous Canadians and groups representing youth. And we also consult the members of our caucus. And so we'll have discussions with them about where it is we think we're going, and we'll get feedback. Then, once you started drafting a bill, members of caucus, the same as other Canadians, are not allowed to see a bill until it's actually tabled in the House. But once the bill is tabled in the House, of course, the minister or the parliamentary secretary will present it to caucus. We'll have ongoing feedback from caucus as it goes to a committee, because on every committee, there's Liberal members along with Conservative members, New Democrat and Bloc. And the government, meaning the minister and the parliamentary secretary, and will work with the Liberal members of that committee to see how the Liberal members want to amend the bill. And so every bill is discussed within the Liberal caucus, and feedback is taken about where the bill should go. And each member brings their stakeholders and their constituents' views. And then at committee, the bill is further amended, including, like I mentioned, at the Heritage Committee that I happen to sit on, in addition to the HUMA Committee, which is where I'm the parliamentary secretary, and the US-Canada Committee on the Economic Relationship between Canada and the US. And I bring my own amendments. And I'll bring them whether or not the government agrees with them, because I believe that I have a role as an individual member to bring amendments. But of course, being an effective member, I know that my amendments are more likely to be successful if the government agrees with them. So I do everything I can to negotiate with the government my amendments and make sure they do agree with them, in the same way that I negotiate with the Conservative members, the Bloc member, and the NDP member of my committee. I'm the most successful when I'm able to get everybody to agree with what it is that I want to do. And I am one of those members that really tries to talk to the opposition in the same way I try to talk to the government. There's going to be areas where the Bloc and I are never going to agree on language policy and on separation, but I may well agree with the Bloc member on issues related to labor. And I work very closely with my Bloc critic in labor, the same way I work with my Conservative critic and my NDP critic.
Before we go on to the next question, there are two comments, one from Ricky Guthers Madoff saying, "Thank you, Anthony, for all your hard work. Wishing you continued strength and success." Another comment from Sandra Kuku, "We are lucky to have you, Anthony. Yashakoach to you."
Thank you, Sandra.
Next question is coming from Jack Shakovich, who's asking, what is the government's position on the effectiveness of the AstraZeneca vaccine?
So the government's position would be to defer to public health, because really public health is the one that, makes that determination. But as far as I understand in Canada, public health continues to reaffirm, and the government then would also reaffirm that the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is what I got for my first dose, is perfectly effective. The AstraZeneca vaccine in some groups of people has had a very rare side effect of blood clots, particularly younger women. And so there's cautionary, advice with respect to the AstraZeneca vaccine, particularly since we now have a huge supply of Pfizer and Moderna. But there's nothing ineffective about the AstraZeneca vaccine. Anybody who got it is perfectly well protected. And I wouldn't worry for myself or anyone else that got AstraZeneca.
I have a question from Murray Levy. If my wife and I, both fully vaccinated seniors, return from Las Vegas after October 15th this year, why are we all lumped in with all other returnees to Canada under the catch-all Arriva-Can and reporting system? In addition, why can't the federal government carve out a special section of Arriva-Can so we can only have to take a COVID test when actually landing in Canada? The test before boarding a plane makes no sense at all.
Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure right now. As of July 6th, you will be differentiated because you will be, as a Canadian citizen, returning to Canada exempt from the quarantine, provided that you have a negative test upon return. In order to insert your information of proof of vaccination, you need to have the application downloaded, and you need to allow the Canadian authorities to have that proof of vaccination before you arrive in the country, so that you're treated accordingly at the border. With respect to the need for a negative test upon embarkation, meaning within a few days of the time you take your departure flight, that is common practice right now in the United States as well, and in other countries for international flights. I can't tell you when public health will recommend that be removed.
I'd like to thank you, Anthony. Now I'd like to call on Rabbi Michael Whitman to thank our guest speaker this evening.
Thank you, Lawrence. First of all, I want to thank Lawrence for the tremendous leadership in arranging this program, and in, Lawrence, your masterful facilitating of this section. Like everything you do, it's done as a professional, and we appreciate everything that you do. I want to skip ahead and just say a tremendous thank you to Alvin Delovich, who will be speaking next. We're coming to the end of an incredibly successful series speakers, and a large share of that success is due to Alvin, his effort, his persistence in making sure that every one of these sessions is as successful as it can be. We are lucky to have Alvin together with our other lay leaders. He has done a tremendous job. Anthony, I'm so grateful to you for agreeing to do this tonight. In addition to the words of praise that Lawrence mentioned about you in the beginning of the program, I want to add that in my view, what I see in you is this intense empathy and caring for every single constituent and every single Canadian. And it is that caring, that desire to be of service that I think puts you apart from just about everybody else. I am so happy to call myself your friend. You are a great friend to Adath and to our community. And I want to wish you, on behalf of all of us, Hatzlacha, success and strength in everything you do. Thank you very much, Anthony Housefather.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're
Anthony,
very welcome.
So I'd like to now call upon Alvin Delovich, who will close out the speaker series for this part of the year as we take a little break for the summertime. Alvin?
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, for a very inspirational and educational speech tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and your delivery was so engaging and effective, and truly appreciated your comments on anti-Semitism and the rights of English-speaking Quebecers under Bill 96. On behalf of the Adath, thank you again, Anthony, for a very memorable presentation, and trust that you will visit us again, and hopefully next time in person. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our first season of Everyone Has a Story speaker series. We will be taking a break for the summer months and will return on September the 12th with a joint collaborative event presentation with the Adath Sisterhood. That presentation will be made by Linda Fishman and called Repairing Rainbows. It's a truly fascinating story. And I strongly suggest that you note that date now, as it is again September the 12th. We're very, very thankful to all our sponsors and supporters this past season. And we are so fortunate to have our series picked up by Crave TV and HBO for a second season next year. Just kidding, by the way, on that. Creative team is already hard at work on putting together another set of wonderful presentations for next year. If any of you have any ideas, thoughts, suggestions on who might have a special story to tell, please reach out to me, and we will be more than glad to review it together. At this point, I would like to thank all our speakers who made this series so memorable and successful this season. First off, the Honorable Lawrence Bergman, the bone marrow donor specialist, Ellen Delovich, the never give up on your dreams and golden arches man, Albert Levy, our wonderful and very own renowned Rabbi Michael Whitman, two very special COVID doctors, Dr. Tannenbaum and Dr. Shepard, the very community-minded Sid Melech, and the young, inspirational, and very educational Dr. Mindy Eklov, as well, of course, our very special MP Anthony Housefather. A big shout out to Stu Gutman, the man behind the camera, for all his technical support during this presentations. And to all of you, have a very safe and healthy summer. And thank you again for all your help and support. And we'll see you again in 5782. Thank you.